Louisiana v. Callais is the test case, but the real fight is in the Southern House map. This is why the Supreme Court ruling matters far beyond one state, one district, and one congressional map. This was not a technical redistricting case. This is actually the beginning of a national fight over whether Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act can continue to be used as a legal crowbar to force race-based districts that often produce Democratic seats. The left wants to frame this as the Supreme Court is gutting voting rights. That is furthest from the truth, and that's not what happened. The court said something much more basic. The Voting Rights Act protects access to the ballot. It does not give politicians on either side a blank check to sort Americans by race or political advantage. That is why this ruling is so politically explosive, especially for Democrats, because they spent years using the redistricting playbook that was simple. Identify racial disparity, demand a race-based district, call it civil rights, and lock in the political benefit. And the Supreme Court just made that playbook much harder to run. In Louisiana v. Callais, the court actually held the Voting Rights Act did not require Louisiana to create an additional majority-minority district. Because the Voting Rights Act did not require that map, Louisiana could not use compliance with the Voting Rights Act as a compelling interest to justify race-based line drawing. The results are clear. The map was unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. And that actually matters because the control of the House may come down to 5 to 10 seats. And every district line, every court ruling, and every map is going to matter for this midterm and beyond. And Democrats know this. This is exactly why. They're not fighting to persuade voters. They were actually trying to change the battlefield before voters even show up to vote. They go to court. They demand a mid-decade map change, they push racial formulas, and they call it representation when it helps them win power. But hey, when Republicans draw maps for partisan advantage, Democrats call that a death to democracy. That is hypocrisy. Democrats do not hate gerrymandering. They hate gerrymandering when it doesn't benefit them. They do not hate courts intervening in elections. They only hate courts that do not deliver democratic outcomes. That's exactly why they're having a meltdown over the Supreme Court decision. And they don't hate changing the rules. They only hate it when Republicans learn how to play by the rules that Democrats created and win. And this ruling exposes all of it. So the real question is what happens to not only Louisiana, but what happens across the South based on this decision? Louisiana is the cleanest example because it's the case itself. The court struck down the 2024 map that created a second majority black district. Now, that doesn't mean that every majority minority district in America is just going to disappear tomorrow. That is not the right way to describe it, but it does mean that states now have stronger arguments that the Voting Rights Act cannot be used as a shield for race-first redistricting unless the law really requires it. And that's the key line. The Voting Rights Act protects voters. It does not authorize racial engineering. Now let's look at what happened in Florida right after this case. Florida is the first major political response to the Callais era. Republican leaders immediately understood the House map. They see an opening to revisit districts that were previously defended under race-based theories by Democrats. So it's safe to say Florida didn't wait for the dust to settle. Florida actually looked at the ruling and understood the political consequences immediately. Now, Florida still has its own constitutional redistricting rules. They have to look at the Constitution, their process. I'm sure there'll be litigation, so this isn't over. But Florida shows Democrats exactly why they're worried. The Supreme Court changed the legal weather, and Republican-led states are already asking, how far can they go? And then there's Alabama. Alabama is where the left won one of the biggest recent redistricting victories. A court-ordered map actually helped to create a second black opportunity district, and that again helped Democrats. But after Callais, Alabama Republicans have a much stronger argument that the old Section 2 theory is weaker. We need to be precise here, though. Alabama doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have an overnight 2026 change. There's still court orders, timing issues, election deadlines. But again, Alabama now is a future battlefield. And the line is simple here. Alabama is where the left won the last redistricting war, but Louisiana may be where the legal theory actually starts to collapse here for them. Then we look at Tennessee. Tennessee actually shows how fast this political world understood the decision. The ruling came down, and Republicans immediately began discussing whether Tennessee's Memphis-based Democratic district should survive in its current form based on the Supreme Court decision. That meant the Callais ruling instantly again became a political tool. Tennessee is at a pressure point. The court has moved, and Republicans saw an immediate opening. Same thing with Mississippi. It matters here too, because this ruling in Mississippi is not limited to congressional maps. The governor in Mississippi has actually called a special session to redraw Mississippi Supreme Court districts. And that tells us all something very important, that the Callais decision is already being understood as a new legal framework for race-conscious redistricting fights at a state level too. Now, again, this is going to be tested. This is not a new rule of the game. When race drives the map, the state will have to prove the law actually requires it. Political convenience is not enough. Racial balancing will not be enough. A party's desire to protect a favorable seat will not be enough. Look at Georgia. Georgia is the future battleground. It's not an immediate change, but it is more politically competitive. And there's actually several Democratic held seats that have a large Black population. The Callais ruling again gives Republicans a stronger argument that racial composition can't be treated as a controlling factor forever. Again, this does not mean every map is going to change tomorrow, but it does mean that every race-based defense gets a harder look. And then there's South Carolina. South Carolina, again, it's not immediate redraw here either, but it is a warning sign. South Carolina has already been part of major litigation over race and congressional maps. Callais gives Republican map makers a stronger argument when Democrats continue to claim that the Voting Rights Act requires race-based protection of certain districts. South Carolina is actually going to show the new legal fight. Democrats will always call Republican maps racially based, and Republicans need to start pushing back and say partisan advantage is not the same thing as racial discrimination. And after Callais, that distinction matters more than ever. And this brings us to what this is all about. The midterms. This is not an overnight redraw of the entire South, but it is something more important because now we're looking at a new legal map for every future redistricting fight, and Democrats know that. The House is going to come down to 5 to 10 seats. They know that race-based litigation has helped protect the seats, but that old playbook has been thrown out the window by the Supreme Court. This is exactly why Republicans should be on the defensive about this ruling. The message is simple. One person, one vote. Not one racial category, one political outcome. Districts should serve citizens. Citizens should not be sorted to serve districts. That is the contrast, and that is something that every Republican should repeat over and over again. And Democrats have a major hypocrisy problem. They have spent years saying democracy dies when Republicans question elections, but they question the legitimacy of every court that rules against them. Democrats have spent years saying institutions must be protected. Those are their words, but when they lose at the Supreme Court level, they threaten court packing. Democrats have spent years saying maps must be fair. But when they have power in blue states, they redraw, redesign, manipulate maps to squeeze out every possible Democratic seat. So spare Americans the lecture about democracy, because this isn't about democracy at all. It's about control and it's about power. When the rules hurt Democrats, they call the rules racist. That's their playbook. When courts help Democrats, they call it justice. When courts stop Democrats, they call it extremism. Just see what they're saying about the Supreme Court today. The left's real fear is not the Supreme Court ended voting rights, because it didn't. The left's real fear is that courts weaken one of their favorite ways to manufacture House seats, calling everything racist. The Voting Rights Act was meant to protect access to the ballot. It was never meant to become a Democratic seat protection plan. That is the line Republicans should repeat over and over again. Most Americans don't want to be treated as a racial inventory. They don't want their communities to be carved out by political lawyers who see them as race first, then voters, and last as citizens. They want fair elections. They want equal rules. They want representation to actually answer to the people and not to these racial formulas. That is why the ruling matters. Louisiana is the test case. Florida is the first response. We're going to see Alabama is going to have a pending fight. Tennessee is the pressure point. Mississippi shows this goes far beyond even Congress as they're looking at Supreme Court races there. Georgia and South Carolina show where the next round of litigation could go. This ruling may not redraw every single seat before November, but it does change the rules of engagement for every map fight after November. And if the midterms come down to a handful of seats, this decision may be remembered as the moment the Supreme Court stopped race from being used as a backdoor to political power. And here's the bottom line. Democrats thought Section 2 was a map-making machine, and the Supreme Court reminded them through this ruling it is a voting rights law. The court did not end voting rights. It actually ended the idea that voting rights language can be used to justify racial gerrymandering whenever it helps one political party. And Americans today are seeing that we're not racial categories. We are citizens first. And the Constitution does not exist to help politicians draw themselves back into power.